Kirk Herbstreit. He has become a very unpopular figure in the college football space. And namely, recently, it is because of his comments about Indiana. He finally broke his silence. Like, we never really heard anything else. He did the live hit after the Tennessee-Ohio State game where he trashed Indiana's inclusion into the playoff. And then we never really heard anything after that from him. He did an interview this week with Andy and Ari on 3 and spoke a lot. I will admit, watching the entire interview, I was like, okay, well, what I saw on social was not totally the whole story here. Okay. He's getting crushed for the clips that they put out on social. And I will certainly address that because I didn't love the clips that were circulating out there on social either. And I kind of thought, man, feels like you're just making things worse for yourself here, Kirk. But I gave the entire interview a listen, and I think it gives me a different perspective here than most. And again, I am the guy that's fighting anti-power to and big brand narratives here, right? But this was like a very all over the place sort of interview and requires a lot of nuanced discussion, I think, from Kirk Herbstreit. So look, I've told you guys for a long time, I feel like Herbstreit has been a big brand guy, kind of a big brand shill, which if you've worked that long at ESPN these days, you know, where ESPN has gone over the last decade, you kind of have to be. So like, I understand it. If you're going to cover college football at a national level and be really successful with it, it's hard to have a whole lot of like pushing against power to narrative in you. And I think that's become very true for Herbstreit. Now, to me, it is still sad because back in the day when it wasn't quite the media environment was not nearly as polarized like that. And TV was not controlling the sport nearly as much as they have in this new realignment era. You know, Herbstreit was a really good ambassador for the sport and one of the most likable guys out there. And I thought it was great. So it's sad to see him kind of get swept up in all of that. And I'm giving him a little bit of leeway there with just the reality of, I think, where he's at. Here's what he said about Indiana. He said, quote, Indiana having 11 wins and beating nobody. That doesn't mean they were one of the 12 best teams. Remember, there's a big difference between deserving and best. And he also said Indiana was not a team that should have been on that field against Notre Dame when you consider other teams that could have been there. First comment was the ESPN interview. Next comment was College Game Day, I believe, the next day. So 2 comments where he really like doubled down. He said it one night, and then he doubled down the next day on College Game Day. Indiana was not a team that should have been on that field against Notre Dame when you consider the other teams that could have been there. Now, this is going to come back to be the most damning statement that he made throughout that whole saga when it comes to what he actually said in the On 3 interview. Part of the problem here, too, is that he made those comments from the broadcast booth when he had just watched Tennessee get crushed by Ohio State, lose by a far wider margin than what Indiana lost to Notre Dame by. And so the comments came across as extra tone deaf because, like, dude, you're the guy that just did that game and watched that game, which was not close. So now here's what circulated on social media. There were 2 things. One that I will talk about later, which was something he may well be lying about. Certainly is tough to believe. But this, he really goes off. And this comment, watching the interview, this was really pretty unprompted. They did not really lead him into this. It was pretty unprompted that he goes on a rant about, man, all these fans that think I'm about SEC teams and trying to get them in there. Says, quote, we could not have paid for a better Final Four with Notre Dame, Ohio State, Penn State, and Texas. The only one missing is Michigan. So this idea that we want Alabama, Texas A&M, and Auburn, are you kidding me? He's saying, like, big brand-wise, what could we have possibly asked for more than this? And this is the part of the interview where he's kind of talking down to the fans, and he does a lot of that. He went on a long diatribe. It really started with Ohio State fans. So if you want to blame anybody, blame Ohio State fans. But he starts in on a rant about how Ohio State fans treated Ryan Day after losing the Michigan game, and even mentioned Will Howard and talking to those guys and Ryan Day's wife and, his kid and everything they had to deal with. And like, yeah, okay, the fans that are going to get that crazy, like, sure, I can be on board with that. But then it transitions into, everybody coming after me for all this and think I'm about big brands. And look, we got the big brands. What is this like SEC thing? Where do people think that I'm coming from with the SEC thing? And that's where I have to take a step back and say, dude, you said Indiana was not a team that should have been on that field when you consider other teams that could have been there. Well, the other teams that could have been there, unless you're a big Miami guy, which I don't know. Did anybody hear Kirk Herbstreit this year stumping for Miami big time? Unless you're a big Miami guy, you're talking about 3 SEC teams if you're saying somebody else should have been there outside of Indiana. So the natural inclination there is to say you'd be somebody pushing for the SEC. It also obviously just matched everything SEC fans were saying. That's a part of the problem, which was oft discussed in that interview. To give Ari credit, he kind of pushed back on Kirk like, hey, to be fair, you were saying basically what SEC fans were saying, whether you realized it or not. Which Kirk was saying, I didn't realize that. I wasn't trying to do that. Whatever. There's going to be some inconsistency here. You have to accept some of that. But he did. Then it gets to the back half of this interview, and Herbstreit starts to walk some things back where they get into the discussion about Indiana. And Kirk said, hey, my bad. I didn't frame that the way that I really wanted to. Here was my point. And now I'm directly quoting from him again. He says, don't take an SEC team, take another Big Ten team. My point wasn't to pick on Indiana. My point was, let's say you had a 9-3 Iowa, and Iowa went to Columbus and Penn State and Ann Arbor and Madison. Just because we get these teams that get to 11 or 12 wins, is it automatically that you get to 11 wins so you get in? Or should Iowa at 9-3 get looked at because they went to Columbus at night? And he goes on to say, my concern would be that if we do this, teams will dumb down their non-conference schedules in a race to 11 or 12 wins, basically. Above all else, and we would get worse games and yada yada. Kind of like what the Greg Byrne at Alabama response was in the immediate aftermath of that. If you remember that, the Alabama AD being basically said, well, we'll never schedule anybody tough again. Why would we do that? Which sort of missed the point because you lost conference games. So Kirk also said, he would go on to say, I'm not saying Indiana wasn't one of the best teams. I just didn't like the logic that got them in. That's on me for pointing to Indiana and using them without further explanation. And then Kirk said, Alabama, this is a direct quote, said Alabama had no shot. I was very, very clear leading up to it. Okay. It's also, again, you got to consider, Kirk, what you did last year with stumping for Alabama over Florida State, which is still very fresh in a lot of people's minds. Kirk would then concede that there was not, Ari started pushing back well, who would you put in? There was not a good option other than Indiana. There was not a 9-3 Iowa that had played those tough road games. And so Kirk conceded. He was like, yeah, you're right. There really wasn't another great option. That's fair. And then he would go on to say, well, when I did that live hit with Linda Cohn, it was at the end of 3 straight grueling days of broadcasting. I really just wanted to go home. So I had more of an edge to me than I normally would. And this is where I will start to have a little bit of empathy and understanding for Kirk Herbstreit and saying, look, I've never been a guy that's traveling across the country to do, multiple broadcasts over the course of 3 or 4 days like he is. But I have done my fair share of broadcasts and grueling days back in the 10 years that I was doing this full time. And when you get to the end of one of those, yeah, you definitely can be caught in a position where you're a lot grumpier than you normally would be because of the situation you've been put in work-wise. So I get it. I understand that. I can level with him a bit on that. Again, part of the problem is then the next day he's doubling down on it with the more damning comments on College Game Day. It's here and there. But, he then goes on to make this big point about, hey, I love that our sport, we have people that are passionate enough to care like this, and I would rather it be like this than baseball. He pointed out, I'm a Reds fan, and there's 7 of us that actually care. No one really cares. It's a regionalized sport, and people don't get this passionate and fired up about it, and I love that that's where our sport is at. Now I'm okay, well, this is better. Maybe lead with this. Why didn't we lead with this? It was kind of speak down to the fans at first and then come back around and make some reasonable comments about like, hey, I do appreciate the passion. And I'm more lately, and you might look at this and say, John, I followed you on Twitter for a while and I'll buy this. It's been lately, but lately, I mean, I've toned it down a lot because I'm kind of with him. Like gets tiring. They had a long discussion about how, you just are in a worse mood when you're sitting around arguing with people on Twitter. And yeah, I mean, I try to do less of it because it just can make you a more miserable person. So like, I appreciate where he's coming from here. Hey, love the passion. I'm not going to sit around and argue with people as much, but it is great that we work in a place where there's a lot of passion. And those of you who saw my interaction with JD Piquel from On3 the other day, he basically hit me with that too. And he took the high road when I was calling out his comments about the SEC, which like, hey, he and I do not see eye to eye on the SEC at all. But he was a really good dude about it. And that's one thing he said to me in the DMs when we were talking about it. I was kind of like, hey, man, like, yeah, like, sorry. I appreciate you taking the high road. Sorry for being a dick. And he was like, hey, it's cool. I appreciate that we work in a sport where like everyone's this passionate. I'm like, all right, like I respect and appreciate that attitude. Kind of refreshing, especially with what, Twitter has turned into these days. So there are a lot of pieces of this where I'm like, okay, I can level with you, Kirk. I can level with you. And there's some good there. It was just interspersed in an interview that was also filled with a lot of like, man, why are you turning into this guy that wants to just talk down to all of college football fandom and be really just kind of high and mighty for a lot of it. Then there's also this. The part that most people are pointing out seems to be a lie. And I definitely doubt, I'll put it this way, I have some doubts about this being fully all the way true. So on the subject of Twitter, Kirk Herbstreit said, quote, I don't have it. My son tweets stuff out. I don't read anything. I don't see anything. The last part, like I can agree, I can believe. And he was telling Ari Wasserman over and over again in the interview, like, dude, you should delete Twitter. You'll be happier. Just delete it. So him saying, I don't read anything, I don't see anything, I can believe that. For the most part, he wouldn't be sitting around checking the replies. There's no way. I mean, he got bombarded after the Indiana comments. So if you were reading or listening to any of that, I don't know how you would have the self-control to not respond to at least some of it. Now, saying my son tweets stuff out, that I'm more skeptical about. Like, I know you're telling me your son is the one who's really doing all that. And, there was one tweet that he responded to somebody I mentioned that the other day on a show, an Oklahoma State fan that, these BS narratives or whatever. I don't know. Kirk was cussing a lot in this interview. It certainly seemed like it would fit in line with being Kirk and not his son. And it feels like a lot of trust to put in your son to give them your entire Twitter account, just being a public facing representation of you. That's a lot. So I don't know. That's where I'm just like, there are some things, if Kirk would have just stuck to the back half of the interview where he's showing some contrition and backing down on the Indiana point and saying, I love the fans' passion. Like, I understand it's better that we have a sport where people care like this than we don't. If you would stick to that instead of these Twitter people, I don't have it. My son tweets it out. And, look, you guys think you're so smart thinking you got me nailed for being an SEC shill, but we got the best brands. And, there's even an angle of that where you're like, okay, well, you're still riding in hot here. Like, hey, what we care about is the brands and this is great. And all I care about is big brands, which obviously a lot of us around here are not going to like that being like the way you want the sport represented all the time. So I don't know. I will say you should watch the entire interview. I would play you clips, but I'd get flagged. I would certainly lose monetization, maybe worse here on YouTube. So I can't play you the clips. I wish that I could. So I had to just kind of do that recap the best that I could. But I would encourage you to go watch the whole thing instead of just seeing the social media clips, because I think it's probably a little bit unfair to just use those as the barometer for like the only things that he said. It was a little bit better, but it did feel like a guy who wanted to make some points and say, hey, I'm above you. I study this all the time. I'm giving my opinion and you guys don't know what you're talking about. But then kind of felt bad about it later and was like, all right, you know what? In fairness, here you go. I'll throw you a bone. That's what it felt like to me from Kirk Herbstreit throughout that.